The first arrow took the raider through the throat before Jeremiah Weston even registered pulling the string. He was already knocking the second when the war horn sounded again from the tree line, and the pale wraith light that clung to the charging shapes below the wall told him this was no ordinary raid. Fire arrows arced overhead and thudded into the granary roof. Men were screaming somewhere behind him, and the militia line that was supposed to be holding the gate had already broken and scattered toward the well square. Jeremiah's hands did not shake, though his heart hammered hard enough to bruise his ribs. He had made these arrows himself, fletched everyone with his own 2 hands through long winter nights, and he trusted them more than he trusted most people. What he did not expect, what made him nearly drop his bow entirely, was the orc woman who vaulted the crumbling parapet stone beside him and planted herself at his shoulder as though she had always belonged there. "Do not stop shooting," Ragesh Rageborn said, her voice a low rasp of iron and smoke, already swinging a curved blade in a wide arc that took the legs out from under a shrieking, half-translucent shape climbing the broken stair. "I will hold what comes close. You hold what comes far." "You are supposed to be locked in the smokehouse," Jeremiah said, even as he loosed a third arrow into the throat of something that should not have had a throat, something gray and thin and wrong, more shadow than flesh, wearing the rotted remnants of war paint that had not been fashionable in 3 generations. "The smokehouse door was made by men who have never met a woman who did not want to stay inside it," she answered, and there was something almost like humor in it, dark and fierce, even as her blade cut down another wraith shape at the base of the ladder. "Now be quiet and shoot, Fletcher. I did not climb over that wall to watch you die out of politeness." That was the night everything between them began in earnest, though the truth was it had been building for 2 months already, ever since she had walked out of the tree line alone with her hands raised and asked, in the flat common tongue of the border, to speak with whoever made the arrows. Kestrel Hollow was not much of a village yet. It was a scattering of new-cut timber roofs rising inside the bones of an old fort that had been abandoned for 3 generations. Ever since the last border war had burned itself out and left nothing behind but broken stone, weed-choked foundations, and the kind of silence that made travelers cross to the far side of the road rather than pass too close. The magistrate who had petitioned the crown for the resettlement charter, a narrow, ambitious man named Corwin Hale, liked to tell newcomers that the ruin had simply been forgotten. He did not like to talk about why it had been abandoned in the first place, nor why the old stone of the outer wall was scorched black in patterns that no ordinary fire could make, nor why, once every year on the night the almanacs called the Long Dark, something came out of the tree line that was not quite alive and not quite dead and threw itself at that same wall until dawn. Jeremiah Weston had come to Kestrel Hollow because a man could make a decent, honest living as the only bowyer within 2 days' ride of a border settlement, and because there was nothing left for him in the town he had grown up in after his mother died and the house was sold to pay her debts. He was 26 years old, broad through the shoulders from years of bending yew and ash over a shaving horse, with hands scarred pale from bowstring burns and a quiet, careful way of speaking that some mistook for shyness and others mistook for weakness. He was neither. He simply did not see the use in wasting words. He had built his shop against the inside of the old fort wall itself, in the shell of what had once been the armory, because the stone kept the damp out, and because something about working with his back to that wall felt right, felt like standing guard over something even when he could not have said what. He had not expected, on an ordinary gray morning in early autumn, to look up from a half-finished longbow and see an orc woman standing in his doorway with the morning light behind her, tall enough that she had to duck beneath the frame, her presence filling the small shop like a drawn storm. "You are the one they call Weston," she had said. "Not a question. I am." He had set down his knife slowly, not because he feared her, though perhaps he should have, but because a man learned caution around anyone who could snap his spine like kindling if she chose to. Most folk around here would rather I not have visitors who carry a blade that size. Most folk around here have already decided what I am before I open my mouth. Her eyes, a deep amber that caught the light like a hearth fire banked low, had swept the racks of unfinished bows along the wall, the bundles of fletching feathers, the neat rows of arrows sorted by weight and length with a fletcher's obsessive care. I did not come here for their opinion. I came here for yours. I need arrows, human, and I am told yours fly truer than any others on this border. He had looked at her then, really looked, and it had taken him a long moment to find his voice again, because she was, without question, the most striking creature he had ever laid eyes on. She wore fitted leather warrior's leathers, dark umber and worn soft with use. A breastplate lay snug over a body honed lean, and powerful by a life that had clearly never once been gentle. Thigh-high leggings cinched tight beneath a wide belt that held the curved blade and a hunting knife both. Her tusks small and neat, and somehow only adding to the fierce, dangerous beauty of her face rather than diminishing it. Her dark hair was bound back in a single thick braid that fell past her shoulder, and there was a long-healed scar along her jaw that did nothing at all to soften the impression that she was a woman who had survived things most men would not have. Arrows for what? He had asked, because a bowyer who did not ask questions about intended use was a fool or a fool's accomplice, and he intended to be neither. For a debt that is owed, she had said, and something had moved behind her amber eyes that he would later learn to recognize as old grief wearing the mask of anger. And for a wall that will need holding before the season turns, whether the men who live behind it welcome my help or not. That had been the whole of it, that first meeting. He had not turned her away. He had not, in that moment, entirely understood why he had not turned her away, except that there was something in the set of her shoulders that reminded him of himself on the worst days after his mother's funeral, alone in a world that had already decided he did not matter enough to be worth its trouble. Magistrate Hale had been furious when he found out, of course, storming into the shop 3 days later with Captain Aldrich Prout of the militia at his heels, demanding to know why the bowyer was fletching arrows for an orc. Of all the reckless, treasonous, lunatic things a man could do on a border settlement not 6 months into its charter. She saved 4 of my sheep from a wolf pack last week without being asked, Jeremiah had said, which was true, though it was not the whole truth, and Hale's thin face had gone the color of curdled milk. An orc does not do favors for humans out of the goodness of her heart, Weston. They do not have hearts to be good with. Everyone on this border knows what her kind did to the last garrison that held this fort. Everyone on this border also knows what the last garrison did first, Jeremiah had said quietly, and that had been the moment the magistrate's eyes had gone flat and cold, because it was an old wound in Kestrel Hollow, older than the charter, older than any of them, and no one liked to speak of it in the daylight. The fort had fallen once before, generations back, and the stories about why did not agree with each other, except that they all agreed something terrible had happened here, and that the land itself had not forgotten it. Ragesh had not gone anywhere in the end. She had built herself a small lean-to against the outside of the fort wall, close enough to the settlement to hear its bells, but far enough that the more fearful villagers would not have to look at her while they drew water, and she had stayed through the autumn, hunting for the village when the militia's own hunters came back empty-handed, mending the wall's crumbling stonework with a strength that put 3 men to shame, and coming, more and more often, to sit in the doorway of Jeremiah's shop in the long blue evenings while he worked, and she sharpened her blade, and neither of them said very much at all, because there did not seem to be a need to. It was on one such evening with the last light going gold and thin across the ruined battlements that she finally told him why she had come. You know this fort was not always a ruin, she said, turning her blade slowly in the last of the sun, watching the light run along its edge rather than looking at him. You know there was a garrison here once, a baron's men, and before that there was a truce. I know the stories, Jeremiah said carefully. He had heard fragments over the years, the way a man hears fragments of every old horror, softened and reshaped by time until no one quite remembered which parts were true. A peace broken, blood on both sides. My grandfather's grandfather was Goreth Rageborn, she said, and his hands went still over the bow in his lap, because he knew that name, had heard it whispered by old men in taverns the way children whispered ghost stories. Chieftain of the Rageborn line. He came to this fort under a flag of truce, with his war band disarmed and his own hands empty, to swear peace with the baron who held this wall. He believed the oath was sacred. He believed a blood vow, sworn over the old cup, could not be broken by either side without the land itself rising up to punish the breaker. What happened? Jeremiah asked, though some cold, sinking part of him already suspected, already felt the shape of the answer settling over his shoulders like a weight he had been carrying his whole life without knowing its name. The baron's bowmen killed them where they stood, Ragesh said, and her voice did not rise, did not break, though her grip on the blade had gone white-knuckled. Every one of them, disarmed, unarmed, trusting a vow sworn in blood. My ancestor died with the baron's cup still in his hands and an arrow through his throat, an arrow fletched so well, so true, that men said afterward no ordinary bowyer could have made it. The curse was born in that moment human. The oath was broken, and the land drank the blood of the broken oath, and it has not forgotten. Every year on the night the almanacs call the long dark, the slain rise from where they were buried beneath this wall, and they will keep rising, keep throwing themselves against this stone, until the debt between the two bloodlines is paid or forgiven. Two bloodlines, Jeremiah said slowly. Yours and whose? Ragesh looked at him then, and there was something almost gentle in the way her amber eyes moved over his face, something that made his chest ache before she even spoke the words. The bowyer who fletched the killing arrows was named Weston, she said. It has taken me 11 years to track that bloodline to this fort, Jeremiah Weston. I did not come here for a debt owed to me. I came here because the debt is owed by both our families, and I intend to see it paid, one way or another, before I let this wall claim another life. He should have felt fear at that. He should have felt the old, familiar chill of being told he was cursed, tainted, born into a debt he had never asked to carry. Instead, sitting there in the fading light with her close enough to touch, all he felt was a strange, aching relief, because for the first time in his life someone had looked at the whole shape of him, the ugly inherited parts included, and had not turned away. Then we will pay it together, he said, and meant it more than he had ever meant anything. The long dark came 6 weeks later, and it came the way all true disasters come, without any respect for how unprepared the people beneath it happened to be. It began, that year, not at the wall but in the grain barn at the heart of the settlement, the one building every household in Kestrel Hollow depended on to survive the coming winter. Jeremiah would never be entirely certain, afterward, whether the wraith fire that took hold of the thatch roof was an accident of the season's dry weather or the first cruel opening move of the curse itself, testing the village's defenses before the true assault came at the wall. What mattered in the moment was the sound of the bell ringing wrong, 3 short strokes instead of the usual slow toll, and the sky over the granary square going the color of a wound. He ran toward it without thinking, the way any decent man would, and found half the village already gathered in a helpless, screaming knot around the burning barn, because the fire had caught with unnatural speed, and Widow Agnes Hollies's 2 farmhands were trapped inside, having gone in to save the seed grain before anyone realized the roof beams were already falling. The doors are jammed. Someone was shouting, uselessly, over and over, as though shouting it louder might change the fact. Ragesh arrived at a dead run from the direction of the wall, her braid loose and whipping behind her, and she did not slow down at the door. She hit the warped, swollen timber shoulder first with a strength that splintered the crossbar and sent the whole frame crashing inward in a gout of smoke and sparks, and then she was gone, swallowed into the burning dark of the barn, while half the crowd screamed her name in horror, and the other half screamed it in something closer to awe. Jeremiah did not hesitate either. He grabbed a horse blanket from the trough rail, soaked it in the water butt, and went in after her without a single thought for his own safety, because the thought of her in there alone, of losing her to fire after everything, was simply not a thing his heart would allow him to stand still for. The inside of the barn was a roaring furnace of falling embers and choking smoke. He found the first farmhand collapsed near the grain bins, half conscious from the smoke, and dragged him toward the door by main strength alone, his eyes streaming, his lungs burning. Behind him, he heard timber crack and give way with a sound like the world ending, and turned in time to see Ragesh emerging from the deeper dark with the second farmhand thrown over one shoulder as though he weighed nothing at all, a falling roof beam catching her across the back and shoulder as she came, close enough that Jeremiah's heart stopped entirely for one long, silent second. She staggered but did not fall. She carried the boy clear of the doorway and set him down gently in the square, checking his breathing with a tenderness that seemed almost impossible in those same hands that had just torn a door from its frame. And then, only then, did she allow herself to sway, one hand going to the burn along her shoulder where the beam had caught her. The whole village had gathered to watch, drawn by the smoke and the bell, and for one terrible, suspended moment, no one moved to help her. They simply stared at the orc woman standing bleeding and soot-blackened in their square, having just saved two of their own with her bare hands. And Jeremiah saw, with a cold clarity that made him furious in a way he rarely allowed himself to be, that some of them were still afraid of her even now, even after this. He crossed the square without a word and put his arm around her, taking her weight before she could refuse it, and said, loud enough for every last soul in that crowd to hear, "She just pulled your children out of a fire with her own hands. If any one of you has anything to say about that, say it to me first." No one said anything. Widow Agnes Holly's weeping was the first to move, pressing a wet cloth into Ragesh's hand for the burn and murmuring a thank you thick with shame. And slowly, in ones and twos, the crowd's fear began to crack open into something more complicated, something that was not yet welcome but was no longer quite so easy to call hatred. Only Magistrate Hale remained unmoved, standing apart from the others with his arms folded, and his mouth a thin, hard line, watching the orc woman lean against his bowyer as though the sight offended him personally. That night Jeremiah tended the burn on Ragesh's shoulder in the lamplit quiet of his shop, his hand steady even though his heart was not, and she sat very still and let him, which was, he was beginning to understand, no small thing for a woman who had spent her whole life being the one who did the protecting. "You should not have come into that fire after me," she said, watching him work with an intensity that made his skin warm despite the cool night air. "I did not need saving." "I did not come in to save you," he said, which was a lie, and they both knew it was a lie, and she made a low sound in her throat that was almost a laugh. "Liar," she said softly. "Fine. I came in because the thought of you in there without me was worse than the thought of the fire," he admitted, and his hands stilled against the bandage, and the shop went very quiet, the lamp flame the only thing moving between them. "I know it does not make sense. I have known you 6 weeks. "It makes sense to me," Ragesh said, and her voice had dropped low and rough, and when he looked up her amber eyes were fixed on his mouth in a way that stole all the air from his chest. 6 weeks, 6 years, it does not matter, Fletcher. I have fought beside warriors my whole life who I would not trust with my back turned for a single breath. I have known you 6 weeks and I already trust you with more than that." "Ragesh," he said, and it came out unsteady, half question, half plea. "You have been looking at my mouth for 6 weeks too," she said, and there was that dark humor again, but underneath it something rower, something hungrier. "Do not think I have not noticed, Jeremiah Weston. Orcs are not shy about wanting things. It is humans who dance around it until the dancing becomes its own kind of foolishness." "Then stop dancing," he said, and she closed the last of the distance herself, one hand curling into the front of his shirt with a strength that could have torn the fabric clean off him, and instead simply held him there, steady, close, as her mouth found his. It was not a gentle kiss. There was too much banked heat in both of them for gentle, too many weeks of careful looks and careless almost touches finally breaking loose all at once. She kissed him like a woman who had decided something and did not intend to be argued out of it, and he answered her with everything he had been too cautious to say out loud, his hand rising to the curve of her jaw, feeling the small, sharp point of her tusk against his palm, and finding, to his own surprise, that he did not want her any less careful for it. When they finally broke apart, both of them breathing hard, she rested her forehead against his and let out a low, rough sound that might have been a laugh or might have been something closer to relief. "There," she said. "Now you cannot pretend you do not know." "I never once pretended I did not know," Jeremiah said, and kissed her again. The days after the fire changed things in Kestrel Hollow, though not all at once and not evenly. Old Tomas Ferris the blacksmith, a broad, easy-going man who had never much cared what shape a person's ears were so long as they paid their debts on time, began greeting Ragesh by name in the market square, and even brought her a mended axe head one afternoon with the gruff explanation that she had done half the village's work all autumn and deserved better tools for it. Widow Agnes Holly started leaving a second loaf on the bakery step some mornings, wrapped in cloth, with no note attached, though everyone understood well enough who it was meant for. Children who had once run from her linta began, cautiously, to wave. But Magistrate Hale's hostility only sharpened as the long dark drew closer on the almanac, and Captain Prout, who owed his rank and his comfortable house to the magistrate's favor, sharpened alongside him. There were mutters in the tavern about curses following orcs the way flies followed carrion, about how the fire in the barn had come the same season an orc had taken up residence at the wall, about how a bowyer ought to know better than to let a monster into his bed, no matter how useful her arms were in a fire. Jeremiah heard the mutters and did not care. He had spent his whole life being the quiet man at the edge of every room, overlooked, unremarkable, the sort of man other men forgot to invite anywhere and women forgot to look at twice. And here was a woman who could have chosen any warrior on the border, any chieftain's son, any fierce and worthy rival, and had instead chosen him, had put her hand against his chest and told him, in her low, rough voice, that she trusted him more after 6 weeks than she trusted men she had fought beside for years. He was not going to let a magistrate's fear talk him out of the first thing in his life that had ever felt like being wanted. They grew closer through the weeks that followed in 100 small, charged ways. She would come to sit in the doorway of his shop while he worked, and somewhere in the long evening, the space between them would shrink until her knee rested warm against his, until his hand found its way to the small of her back, while he reached past her for a bundle of fletching feathers, until neither of them pretended any more that these touches were accidental. She taught him, one crisp afternoon at the edge of the wood, how to read the wind for a killing shot the way orc hunters did, standing close behind him with her hands guiding his elbow, her breath warm against his ear, and when the arrow flew true and buried itself in the target, she had turned him around by the shoulder and kissed him hard enough to make the bow slip from his hand entirely. He learned the shape of her laugh, which was rare and always startled him with how young it made her sound. He learned that she had lost her whole war band 11 years ago in a border skirmish that had nothing to do with the old curse, and had spent every year since alone, hunting the truth of her ancestors' death, because grief had left her no better place to put her strength. He learned that she slept with one hand always near her blade, and that the first night she finally slept in his shop rather than her lean-to, curled against his side with the lamp burned low. She had woken twice from old nightmares, and both times had settled again the moment his arm tightened around her. "I did not think I would ever want this," she admitted to him once, very quietly in the dark hours before dawn, her fingers tracing slow, absent patterns against his chest. "A quiet life, A man who makes arrows instead of war. My clan would have called it a small thing to want. Is it a small thing? He asked, half afraid of the answer. No, she said, and pressed her mouth to his shoulder. It is the largest thing I have ever wanted, and it terrifies me more than any battle I have ever stood in. I would rather face the whole cursed war band alone than lose this now that I have it. He did not know, then, how close she would come to having to make exactly that choice. The night of the long dark arrived on the almanac's appointed date, with a stillness that felt wrong from the first hour after sunset. No wind, no birdsong, the whole valley holding its breath. Magistrate Hale had spent the preceding week trying, with increasing desperation, to convince the village council that Ragesh's presence had drawn the curse's attention early, that the barn fire had been proof enough, that the only sensible course was to see her gone from the settlement before the long dark fell. He had very nearly succeeded twice, and both times Jeremiah had stood in the council hall and argued him down with a stubbornness that surprised even himself, reminding them all loudly that it had been an orc's bare hands that pulled two of their own children from a burning barn while half of them stood frozen with fear. But on the afternoon of the long dark itself, with the light already going strange and thin over the tree line, Hale made his final move. He came to Jeremiah's shop with Captain Prout and 4 armed militiamen at his back, and he did not bother with pretense. "The council has voted," Hale said, his thin face pale and rigid with a fear he was trying very hard to disguise as authority. "The orc leaves the settlement before dusk, under guard if necessary. This curse is her family's shame to bear, not ours, and I will not risk one more soul of this village for the sake of your infatuation, Weston." "The curse is my family's shame too," Jeremiah said, standing squarely between the magistrate and the doorway behind which Ragesh stood with her blade already drawn, her eyes flat and dangerous. "You cannot send away half a debt and expect the other half to satisfy whatever comes out of that tree line tonight. You have no idea what you are dealing with, Corwin, and I do. I am dealing with a monster wearing a woman's shape, and I have had enough of watching this village pretend otherwise." Hale snapped and gestured sharply at his men. "Take her." It was Ragesh who stepped forward first, not to fight, though every line of her body promised she could have ended all 4 militiamen before they cleared their swords, but to stand beside Jeremiah with a calm, terrible dignity that made even the armed men hesitate. "I will go where I choose, magistrate," she said, "and I choose to stand at that wall tonight, whether you welcome me or not, because the alternative is watching your whole village burn while I sit safely beyond your borders nursing my pride. But hear me now, and hear me well. When the long dark comes tonight and your men break and run, as they will, because they have never faced what is coming and I have, it will be this Fletcher and I who hold that wall, and it will be his skill and my strength that save the only life you have left worth saving, which is your own." Hale's face went through several colors before settling on a furious, helpless red, and in the end, with dusk already bleeding purple across the sky and no more time to argue, he simply turned on his heel and stalked away, leaving his militiamen standing uncertain in the yard until Captain Prout, muttering something under his breath, waved them back toward the gate. That was how, 3 hours later, Jeremiah Weston came to be standing alone on the crumbling parapet of the old fort wall, the militia already broken and scattered through the streets behind him, the wraith-fire arrows of the risen warband arcing overhead into the granary roof, and how Ragesh Rageborn came to vault the stone beside him with her blade already singing, refusing, as she had told the magistrate she would, to let him fight alone. The battle that followed was unlike anything Kestrel Hollow had ever seen, and unlike anything Jeremiah, in all his years drawing a bowstring, had ever imagined he would live through. The risen warband came out of the tree line in a ragged, howling wave, thin gray shapes that were not quite flesh and not quite shadow, wearing the rotted remnants of war paint and armor from a battle 3 generations dead, moving with a terrible, unnatural speed that no living creature should have possessed. Jeremiah's arrows found their marks with the same unerring accuracy that had made him famous along the border, but even true arrows only slowed the wraiths, did not stop them, and for every shape that fell dissolving into smoke at the base of the wall, 3 more surged up the broken stair behind it. Ragesh fought like something out of the old sagas, her blade a blur of firelight and steel, holding the narrow stair single-handedly against a press of enemies that would have overwhelmed a dozen trained soldiers, shouting encouragement to Jeremiah between strikes, her voice cutting through the chaos like a bell. He kept shooting, kept his hand steady, trusted his aim the way he had trusted it his whole life, and between the two of them, for one long, desperate hour, the wall held. Then the shape came that Jeremiah had somehow known, in the pit of his stomach, was coming all along. He rose out of the ground at the base of the old stair like smoke pouring backward into flame, taller than any wraith that had come before him, wearing the shattered remains of a chieftain's war crown, his eyes twin points of cold amber fire. And the moment Ragesh saw him, her whole body went rigid with a shock, so profound that her blade nearly slipped from her grip. "Gorath," she breathed, and Jeremiah understood with a lurch of horror that the ancestor whose betrayal had begun all of this had risen with the rest, drawn back to the wall where his blood had been spilled, still bound by the same broken oath that had cursed everything after him. The spirit's voice, when it came, was a dry rasp like wind through dead branches, and it spoke in the old tongue at first, then, seeming to notice the human beside her, shifted with cold deliberation into common speech, as though savoring the chance to be understood by both of them at once. "You wear my blood," it said to Ragesh, "and you stand beside the blood of the one who broke the vow. Will you finish what I could not, granddaughter? Will you take his life and end this debt in the old way, blood for blood, as it should have been ended 11 generations past?" "No," Ragesh said, and her voice, though it trembled, did not waver. "I did not come here for vengeance, grandfather. I came here to end this curse, and I will not end it by becoming exactly the kind of monster the humans who broke your oath already believe orcs to be." "Then the debt remains unpaid," the Wraith chieftain said, "and the wall will fall, and every soul behind it with it, and you will have chosen a human's bed over your own blood's honor." Jeremiah felt the fear in that moment not for himself but for her, for the terrible weight of a choice no one should ever have to make between the dead who shaped you and the living who love you, and it was that fear, sharp and sudden, that pushed him forward, stepping past her to stand between her and the rising spirit with nothing but an empty bow in his hands. "Then let the debt be mine to pay," he said, loud enough for the spirit, for Ragesh, for the whole broken night to hear. "My family fletched the arrows that killed your warband. My blood is the other half of this curse, chieftain, not hers. If blood is what your oath demands, take mine and let her go free of it." "Jeremiah," no, Ragesh's cry was raw, furious, terrified, and she lunged to pull him back, but the Wraith chieftain's cold amber gaze had already fixed on him with something that might almost have been curiosity. "You offer your life willingly," it said, "where your ancestor's oath was broken through treachery. That is not nothing, Fletcher, but it is not enough either. A life taken does not undo a life stolen. It only adds another debt to the ledger." "Then what would?" Jeremiah demanded, his heart hammering, his voice steadier than he felt. "Tell me what would end this, because I am not walking away from this wall, and I am not letting her carry a debt that was never hers alone to bear." The Wraith chieftain went very still, and for a long moment the only sound was the distant screaming of the settlement behind them and the low crackle of Wraith fire on the granary roof. When it spoke again, its voice had changed, had gone from cold command to something almost, impossibly, weary. "The oath was broken because two peoples believed they could never trust one another enough to share this land," it said. "It has held for 11 generations because no one who stood upon this wall since has proven otherwise. If you would end it, prove it. Here, now, before the last of the fire dies. Let the granddaughter of the betrayed and the son of the betrayer's bowman choose one another freely, in the sight of the dead and the living both, and let that choice be stronger than the hate that made the wound. That, and only that, will close the debt." Ragesh turned to look at Jeremiah then, her amber eyes bright with unshed tears, her blade still raised, the whole ruined wall lit orange and gold around them, and she reached out with her free hand to grip the front of his shirt, not to pull him close this time, but simply to hold on, the way a person holds on to the one solid thing left standing in a world coming apart. "I did not come to this wall to fall in love with you," she said, low and fierce and shaking. "I came here for vengeance, or for peace, I did not know which, and instead I found a quiet man who makes true arrows and looks at me like I am something worth wanting instead of something to be feared. If choosing you is what ends this curse, Fletcher, know that I would choose you even if it changed nothing at all." "Then choose me," Jeremiah said, his own eyes stinging, his hand rising to cover hers where it gripped his shirt. "Choose me, Ragesh Rageborn, in front of your grandfather's ghost and my whole cowardly village both, because I have loved you since you kicked down that smokehouse door, and I am done pretending otherwise for anyone's comfort but my own." She kissed him then, on the wall in the firelight, with a dying warband and a watching ghost and every terrified soul of Kestrel Hollow still cowering behind shuttered doors all around them. And it was not a gentle kiss, nor a careful one, but a fierce, claiming, unashamed thing, her hand fisting in his shirt, his arms wrapping around her like he meant to never let go. And when they finally broke apart, gasping, the Wraith Chieftain's terrible amber eyes had gone soft, had gone almost, impossibly kind. "It is enough," Goreth Rageborn's ghost said, and his voice was no longer the dry rasp of wind through dead branches, but something closer to an old man's tired sigh. "It is enough, granddaughter. Rest now, all of you. The debt is paid." The wraith fire went out across the whole valley at once, as though a great hand had simply closed over every flame, and the shapes crowding the broken stair dissolved into ordinary smoke and drifted apart on a wind that finally, after a night of terrible stillness, began to blow. Goreth's massive form thinned, wavered, and was gone, leaving behind only the faint, fading impression of a chieftain's crown against the stars. And then even that was gone, and the wall was simply a wall again, scorched stone under a clearing autumn sky, with two exhausted people standing on it holding onto each other as though the ground itself might still give way. The village came out slowly, in the hour after, drawn by the sudden and impossible silence, by the extinguished granary fire that had somehow burned itself out without consuming the roof, by the almanac night that everyone had expected to bring death instead simply ending in ordinary, blessed quiet. They found Jeremiah Weston and Ragesh Rageborn still standing together on the wall, her blade sheathed at last, his empty bow set aside, her arms around him and his around her. And for once, in the pale gray light of a dawn that Kestrel Hollow had not expected to see, no one seemed to know quite what to say. Magistrate Hale arrived at the base of the wall with Captain Prout and what remained of his authority, his face pale, his eyes moving over the scorch marks and the ordinary, unremarkable dawn with a confusion that had not yet had time to become anything else. "What happened here?" he demanded, though his voice had lost most of its old certainty. "A debt was paid," Ragesh said simply, not moving from Jeremiah's side, her chin lifted with all the fierce, unbroken pride that had first drawn him to her in his shop doorway 2 months past. "One this village has carried, unknowing, for 11 generations, and one that will not rise against your walls again. You are welcome to thank us, magistrate, or you are welcome to remain exactly as ungrateful as you have always been. Either way, I am not leaving this wall, and I am not leaving this man, and if that offends your counsel, you may take that matter up with me directly, in daylight, where I will enjoy answering you far more than I enjoyed answering you in the dark." The gathered crowd, weary and disbelieving and alive in a way none of them had truly expected to be by morning, made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a cheer, but was, unmistakably, something warming toward both. Widow Agnes Hollies was openly weeping again. Old Tomas Ferris was grinning outright. Even Captain Prout, looking between the scorched, silent battlefield and the orc woman still standing unbowed atop it, seemed to be reconsidering several long-held opinions all at once. Hale opened his mouth, closed it, and for a long moment simply stood there, a small, narrow man at the base of a wall that had just been saved by exactly the two people he had tried hardest to drive apart. Whatever he might have said was lost, in the end, because Jeremiah did not wait for it. He turned to Ragesh, cupped her soot-streaked face in both scarred hands, and kissed her again, slow and certain this time, with none of the desperate urgency of the night before, but with all of its love laid bare in the clear light of morning, in front of the magistrate who had tried to send her away, in front of the militiamen who had once eyed her with drawn swords, in front of the whole village that had spent 2 months deciding, piece by grudging piece, whether she deserved to belong among them, and had finally, in the space of one impossible night, run entirely out of reasons to say no. "I love you," he said against her mouth, loud enough that there could be no mistaking it for anyone gathered close enough to hear. "I loved you before I understood any of this. I will love you long after everyone here has forgotten there was ever a curse at all." "Good," Ragesh said, and there were tears on her face now too, though her voice had lost none of its fierce, warm certainty. "Because I am not going anywhere, Fletcher, and neither are you. You are mine now, in front of your whole cowardly, wonderful village, and I intend to keep you exactly that way for as long as we both draw breath." The rebuilding of Kestrel Hollow's granary took the better part of the following month, and the whole village turned out for it in a way that felt, to Jeremiah, like something closer to the community the resettlement charter had always promised and never quite delivered until now. Ragesh worked alongside the carpenters and the farm hands with a strength that no one flinched from anymore, and in the evenings she sat in the doorway of his shop just as she always had, only now there was no pretense left between them, no careful distance to maintain for the sake of anyone's comfort but their own contentment. Magistrate Hale never became a warm man, and no one, least of all Jeremiah, expected him to. But he stopped speaking against her in council, and once, grudgingly in front of witnesses, thanked her for the wall, which was as close to an apology as the man's pride would allow, and which Ragesh accepted with a graciousness that surprised even herself, admitting privately much later that she had rather enjoyed watching it cost him so much to say. Jeremiah built her a bow of her own that winter, the finest piece of work he had ever produced, curved yew-backed with horn in the old style, fletched with feathers he had gathered and cured himself over a dozen quiet evenings, and when he gave it to her, she turned it over in her hands with a wonder that made his chest ache, because he understood, watching her, that no one had ever made her a gift simply for the pleasure of giving it before. "This is a bride gift," she said quietly, running her thumb along the grain of the wood, her amber eyes lifting to his with a question in them that was really no question at all. "Among my people, a weapon made by a lover's own hands, given freely, is a claiming. It means I am yours and you are mine before whatever gods either of us answers to." "Then it is exactly what I meant it to be," Jeremiah said. And when she kissed him this time, in the quiet warmth of his shop with the winter wind rattling the shutters outside, it felt less like a beginning than like the settling of something that had already, quietly, become certain between them. That the Fletcher who had spent his whole life overlooked at the edge of every room had been found at last, seen, chosen, and claimed by a woman who could have had anyone at all, and had wanted only him. They were married in the old style the following spring, on the wall itself, with the whole resettled village gathered below to watch, Widow Agnes Hollies weeping happily into a handkerchief, old Tomas Ferris grinning fit to split his own face, and even Magistrate Hale standing stiff and silent at the edge of the crowd, having finally, after everything, run out of arguments worth making. Ragesh wore her fitted leathers polished to a fine dark shine for the occasion, her braid threaded through with a ribbon of deep forest green that Jeremiah had bought from a passing trader. And when the vows were spoken and the old blood bond sealed between them with a shared cup that bore no resemblance at all to the cursed one of legend, save for the peace it now represented, Jeremiah Weston kissed his orc wife in front of every soul who had ever doubted them, and felt, for the first time in his quiet, careful, overlooked life, entirely and unshakably at home.